Okay, we want to welcome our students to the last of our homiletical discussions on Colossians. We will have one more because we're going to talk about Philemon as well. But this is the end of the book, and we're going to focus in on chapter 4, verses 7 through 18. This passage is a little bit different in that we see a long list of names. We see some names that we know and are mentioned elsewhere, and then some names that we know almost nothing about beyond the fact that they're mentioned here. And of course, this brings up some questions as to how do you preach through a section like this? And admittedly, Tim and I both did not preach on this passage when we did our series in Colossians. But if you were planning to go through the whole book textually, you'd come to this, and there are some preaching opportunities here. And I mentioned some of those on the lecture on this section, but we want to share a few more ideas and then discuss a little bit. And I think Tim has maybe gone even further into this than I have. So let's think about what we could do. Now, Tim, you mentioned that you've got an outline for a sermon, but you even thought through that there could be a series on this passage.
If you want to, we can talk about my sermon. Maybe
That's
talk
fine.
about your sermon.
Sure.
And then we talk about the series. We want to do it that way.
Well, and I actually don't have, I had some approaches. I did not put an outline together, but anyway, just some topics that I think are there that I think are good for preaching. So start with your sermon. We'll get to the series at the end.
Let me preface this, but I just wanted to say, that I got around to listening a couple of your videos, and very, very well done.
Brilliant.
I'm only about 1.5 through, so but the other thing I noted was in skimming those videos is the one speech in which I'm involved are all longer, way longer than the ones that don't involve me, and anyone knowing me would not be surprised by that fact. And to all of our students, I apologize.
Oh no, I think it's good. I think the discussions have been some of the best material, so it's all good.
All right, so I need to share my screen and find the correct screen to share. Let's see if I can do that. And now
we got
do the slideshow from the current slide. All right, here's the sermon series, right? That I was fleshing out. And the last one was when we redeemed the time, 2 through 6. And then here's what I began thinking about. Well, 2 reasons I did not preach on this, and it drives me a little bit crazy not to, because I generally preach cover for cover on a book or word for word. But how would I flesh out this 7 through 18? And it is one reason I didn't preach on it was, as we've noted, I had to end my series. The next sermon was going to be the first Sunday in Advent, and I wanted to preach lectionary last year. That was and part of it was I just had a hard time. That was the primary reason, but I had a hard time getting a grasp of how I would preach this topic. And this list of names. And before I tell you the direction I went, I would recommend, if our students can ever find Fred Craddock's sermon on Romans 16 and can listen to it. It is, of course, it's Craddock. Craddock was very inductive. He was not didactic in terms of trying to demonstrate 3 truths like I do. He was, he came up with this idea of overhearing the gospel and really looking more for an emotive response and an emotional response. But his sermon on Romans 16, which can be found on preachingday.com, is just a masterpiece of how he brings in the idea of this is not a list. Don't just call this a list. So I would recommend that to any preacher, any of our students. So I began thinking about this. Well, originally, when I looked at this a year ago, I thought about the idea of when we live in community. And then as I was thinking about it today as a possible title, and it would work, but if you go back to my previous slide, 2 weeks before I had When We Live as a Family, right? And so it seems to be kind of redundant there. And then today, as I was thinking about it and looking at it, reviewing my notes, all of these people, with the exception of probably Epaphras, have never met the Colossians.
Right.
Right? So this is, if I were to give it a title in fitting with the series, I thought in terms of When We Minister at a Distance. Right? Now that title could use some nuancing or some cleaning up, but it could work in this series, but it could also work. I think it could be a possible sermon in terms of how do you deal with brothers and sisters at a distance? If you're a church that sends off missionaries, how do you respond to those missionaries?
Sure.
That's kind of the thinking that I came upon. And so the first point is we open the lines of communication. Tychicus will tell you all the news about me. I'm sending him to you for the express purpose that you may know about our circumstances, and he may encourage your hearts. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then as you go through this passage, there's several kind of links to that, right? This idea of letting them know about Paul. And so when we're ministering at a distance, we want to open the lines of communication. Think about a missionary, right? You want to have open communication.
Sure.
Our church is very strong on that missionary being responsible to us, and letting us know what's going on. What's the word? Responsible is not the exact
accountability
word.
or
Accountable. Thank you, is the word I was trying to come up with. But it should be a two-way street, right?
right.
So the second is we encourage others. There's that line at the end of verse 8, that he may encourage your hearts. And then I jumped down to Epaphras. We wrestle in prayer. Epaphras is always wrestling in prayer for you, that you may stand firm in all the will of God, mature and fully assured. Keep that in mind when I get to the next slide, or the slide after this one. And you notice I have a question mark here. That's intentional. It's not a typo. Sometimes it's a typo, but we complete the ministry. Tell Archippus, see to it that you complete the ministry you've received in the Lord. Now that doesn't go exactly with this idea of ministering at a distance,
Right.
because Archippus is there. If you go back to this whole idea of living as a family, it maybe fits better if you're developing that theme. But it's there in the text, and it's a great point in the text, I think. So I went ahead and included it. Whether I would include it in a sermon with this idea of we minister at a distance, I don't know. I don't know how. I think it still works with these other themes, and you would just have to acknowledge that, well, Archippus is there, but let's think about this. Let's think about what it means to complete the ministry, or maybe helping others complete the ministry, right?
Right. No, I think that works.
And this, I wanted to include this outline. This is my previous outline. I'm going to move my little box here. This is why, notice the parallels, right? We open the lines of communication, we encourage others, we wrestle in prayer, we complete the ministry, we devoted and grateful petition, prayerful concern for God's mission, wise and gracious witness. That's based on 2 through 6, but you can see one of the reasons I was hesitant to develop an entire sermon on verses 7 through 18 when I felt like it was continuing what we talked about 2 through 6. So if you had time, you could use 7 through 18 for illustrative purposes.
Well, you could. I mean, that's a valid
2
point.
through 6. In fact, I may have done a little bit of that.
Right.
Right. So that's what I came up with as potential. Again, I think it would work in a series that we did, but it would serve as a standalone. It would be a good missions sermon, I think.
Yeah, right. Right.
You know, our responsibility to those who minister abroad or whatever.
Some of the themes that I thought that run through this passage and run through Paul in general, maybe is part of this as well. Parallel much of what you've talked about. Not surprising, we're looking at the same passage, but there's some words that stand out to me.
Think a lot.
Well, that's true too. Some words that stand out to me or show up a couple of times in Paul's discussion. The most obvious one for me is faithfulness. Paul talks about that in verse 7 when he's describing Tychicus. He's a faithful minister, and we talked about how that's the word servant, and really fellow servant is fellow slave. I'll come back to that in a minute.
Yeah.
But it's here we're talking about faithful minister or faithful deacon or faithful servant. However, the translators have had to do a little work to try to make sense of this and use these words in ways that make sense throughout this passage, because those words do show up. But I think about him talking about he's commending Tychicus to them. Apparently they don't know him. I mean, that's what I'm assuming here. And he wants them to listen. He wants them to hear the letter that he's got, but also to pay attention to Tychicus, because he's there to tell them about his condition, to encourage their hearts. So he wants them to listen. And one of the ways he describes him is as a faithful person. Well, when we come to Onesimus, here we don't even, there's no mention of Onesimus as a slave, as a runaway, maybe as a thief. The only description we have of Onesimus is in verse 9, our faithful and dear brother, who is one of you. So that word faithfulness shows up here again. The theme also comes through to me as well in verse 10, because he says, my fellow prisoner Aristarchus sends his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, and you've received instruction about him. Now, if we think about the whole story of Mark, we go back to the book of Acts, and we know that part of Paul's problem with Mark is that he wasn't faithful to his mission. He walked away in the middle of the journey, and then we have the big disagreement between Paul and Barnabas, and I covered a lot of that in the lecture on the passage, so I don't want to rework it, but you see what I'm getting through. Somehow they've reconciled, and Paul has dealt with Mark's not necessarily unfaithfulness to God, but unfaithfulness to a certain mission. So you've got Tychicus, you've got Onesimus, you've got Mark. I think you can pick that up in Epaphras in the passage you already mentioned. He's always wrestling in prayer for you. And that sense of faithfulness, being faithful over time, is reflected in that language, that Epaphras is always praying for them. And then you pick it up again when you get down to verse 17, see to it that you complete the ministry you receive from the Lord. To me, that echoes that same sense of faithfulness. So when Paul thinks about qualities that matter to him in the people with whom he's ministering, faithfulness is a big chunk of that, right? So there's ways to bring that out.
Yeah, I have on my desk, somebody did a plaque of Romans 12:12. Maybe because they thought I was lacking in that, but you never know why people give you gifts, right? But be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer.
Right.
So you have that kind of language, and the word faithful there's different than, it's not pistos. It's a different word. In fact, I would probably translate it more like persevering in prayer.
In Romans, it's a different word.
In Romans 12:12.
Yeah.
It's pistos here in Colossians.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a couple other themes that come out to me. One of them is related to what we just talked about. So it's faithful minister with Tychicus, but this word minister shows up a couple of different ways and a couple of different times. We've got Tychicus being a faithful, I would say servant rather than minister, maybe there. And then in verse 17 again, we've got ministry. So you've got this sense of being a servant. What does that look like as we follow Jesus? And even taking that a step further, calling him a faithful minister, and then sundulos,
Fellow slave.
Exactly.
which is how I would translate
I
it.
would too. I
Yeah.
would too. I'm not exactly sure why NIV went the direction they did. Not in the footnote, it's, they give you a footnote to make sure that's the word slave. But
well, I'm no expert on anything, but I'm certainly not an expert on the NIV. But the NIV, they really they avoid slave.
they do. That's right. Well, when we've talked about the undertones and problems with
the
that word.
connotations, I think,
Yeah.
of our American history and how slavery is portrayed, and not just portrayed, but how slavery
it was. Yeah, right.
how it was in American history, and
I get that. I do.
but sometimes you'll see bond servant.
Right.
I don't know in the NIV, but in other translations.
Yeah, maybe New Americans say it. I just checked in our SV and it's same thing, faithful minister, fellow servant. But my problem with that is I'm not sure that fellow servant gives the same sense that Paul's using when he says sundulos. As I mentioned in the lecture, nobody liked the status of slave in the ancient world either.
Right.
RSV's faithful minister, fellow servant too. But anyway, and nobody wanted to be a slave, but these Christians adopted that language on purpose. Paul himself, it's not that he says Tychicus is a slave; he's a fellow slave. But to carry that whole sense of servanthood and serving Christ through this passage, through different ways that people present themselves as servants of Christ, I think could work. And then, and I guess I'm really focusing in on Tychicus and then running that through the passage, but Paul loves to use that prefix in Greek that means fellow, right? The sundulos.
Right.
And then, and we see that at work in other places in this passage as well. We have Aristarchus as a fellow prisoner of Paul. And so I think there's community that comes into this that you could probably take from here and then go back through the letter, because we are co-resurrected or soon resurrected. We are co-crucified with Christ. So that little prefix shows up in that we share all of these things, which in turn, I think, Paul's addressing the sense of community. So each one of those, I think, could present itself as a way to preach through this passage. I don't know that I do one sermon with all three, but you could easily do a sermon with one of those themes. That's probably the way I would approach it if I were going to preach it. Now, I didn't even think about doing a whole series, so you were ahead of me on that.
Repeat those three. I was while listening, maybe you said this, but the New American Standard does use bond servant.
Okay, that's what I said. I seemed like I remembered that was the translation that uses that.
The New English translation, let me go back to this is, finding it online quickly.
Right.
Refers to a dear brother, faithful minister, and fellow slave. The New English translation uses slave there.
They do.
And then immediately footnoted, of course.
Well, sure. I was going to check the
good explanation.
Yeah, even in the updated New American Standard. I didn't know, but it's still faithful servant, fellow bondservant.
Bondservant.
Which at least that gives it a sense of more than just somebody who gets paid to do stuff.
Right. Right. And it's distinguishing between of course, if you use the word minister, you're distinguishing it, but it's a distinguishing from servant in the
right.
So yeah, I just think in our culture, I can't speak for other cultures, the word minister is so loaded now that I'm not, when my people think of a minister, they think of me.
Right.
So,
well, sure.
Of course, a lot of churches use pastor in that role. But it just seems like that role, how often do we use the word minister? How often do we use the word servant too? So you're
well, I think that problem there is a minister holds a quote unquote office, right? A position, if you will. and has certain responsibilities that I'm not sure that's what he means when he calls Tychicus a faithful servant.
No. Your three themes, you mentioned three themes:
So
faithfulness,
faithfulness, service, and community.
service, and community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think all those are there without
yeah.
trying to pull, trying to find something to preach on in this passage and not being faithful to the passage.
I like you're pointing out of the soon passages, and it would be, could you get a series from it? I don't know, but
yeah, I don't know either. I'd have to look back through, right?
Get a sermon. You could get a different sermon if you wanted to do, just go through Colossians or practically go through any of Paul's writings.
Right.
And pick up this whole idea of soon, this fellow.
Right. It's an important concept for him because it seems to tie Christians together.
Because trying to unless you Googled fellow, maybe.
Right.
Because the English translations are all over the map.
Right.
In terms of how they're translating those prefixes.
Right.
So fellow, sometimes co in English.
Well, and I had never really picked up on it that much until, going through this verse by verse, line by line, and seeing that show up several times. And I think McKnight makes some comment about, how fond Paul is of that prefix. And then I'm reflecting, well, yeah, he is. It shows up a lot. So,
Somebody was telling me of, I believe it's Southeast. They're doing a series called Alelon, which are one another.
Right.
And
right.
So it's all about the one another passage.
And there are, yeah.
First, when my friend told me that Alelon, and I was having trouble picturing it, in the Greek, but it's kind of a similar idea that you're picking up this one word that's being used
right
different ways and how that relates to the church.
Right. Do you want to say anything more about the series you were thinking about, or did you have okay. I didn't know how much you had traced it out.
We are picking up oh, sorry, hang on a second. I need to share my slides again. Share screen. Where am I? Here's that again. From current slide. All right, have you got it?
Yep.
So here's possible series. Let me preface this again. This is why the ones with me are longer. I did this in about 30 minutes to an hour.
I'm with you.
What I did is I looked through here and I just started kind of what we call brainstorming. I just kind of started to generate ideas on this as we were preparing for this session. And it's something I don't do as much as I used to, and I need to do more of. But I wanted to point it out because I think to our brothers and sisters in the class or in a future class, especially if you're preparing for preaching or for a regular teaching position in the church, this kind of exercise is really valuable.
It is.
To take let's look for the soon words, the fellow words, and brainstorm that. Let's go through the love one another's, and you can Google that and find them. Let's go through a chapter or a book, and part of what you're having them do, which is sketch out 6 or 8 series, 6 or 8 sermons or messages through Colossians, can be done in a variety of ways with different books, different topics.
And we've talked about a number of ways you could do that in Colossians, right? I mean, we've said virtually every discussion, well, this could be a series. You could look at, different things and create a series from, and this is just one more. So there's lots of ways. We
used to do this when we'd get together.
Right.
And when we were preaching, and that was really a valuable experience. And probably, hopefully, no one in authority in my church has seen this, but it's something that I need to think about doing some more, because after 26 years, it's easy to get a little flat.
Sure.
In what you're preaching. So here's possible series. Lessons from the Lesser Known is a series that I did years ago based on Old Testament characters. In fact, it may very well have been shortly after the Old Testament was written. I mean, it was a long time ago that I did that series. And the title would work. The other thing, the second preface I would say is, don't use these titles. They're not very good. They're just 10-minute, 5-minute, maybe not even that. Same thing with the titles of the individual messages that I'll share in a minute. Yeah, I'm not saying they're great titles. They're just kind of a working title.
Right.
So working together for the gospel, teammates, which may make more sense in America than in an African context. I don't know. Maybe not. I put teammates and coworkers as a possible add-on to that. I would go with something like teammates.
Yeah, I think in our culture anyway, that's a vivid image, right? I think people get that.
I mean, what we're talking about is Paul's coworkers.
That's right. Sure we are.
All right, so here, Tychicus. It was all I could do not mention it in my first sermon, because it's a sermon in and of itself. You picked up on these themes when you were talking about it, right? So he is maybe the consummate teammate. He's the beloved brother, which is a translation I like better than dear brother, but I like the word beloved. It's an older word, doesn't get used as much, but beloved brother, he cared. Faithful minister, he served. Fellow slave, he sacrificed. I mean, that's one way to approach those themes, right?
Yep.
Onesimus, this takes you to Philemon. A slave set free. That's verse 9. But if you go to Philemon, you could that would get you into Philemon, and I know we're going to talk more about Philemon in coming weeks. Mark, the exact same thing you picked up. A forgiven brother is what I called it.
Right.
But the whole idea out of Acts 15 through 40, 36 through 40, Mark dropped in Acts 13. I don't remember the exact verse. There's this little note that he leaves the mission, right? He leaves the mission. By the end of Acts 15, is this second missionary journey?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay. Barnabas wants to bring him back. Paul doesn't want to have anything to do with him. Okay.
And the language there, I was looking for it actually. I mean, it's translated as sharp disagreement. It's a strong word, as I remember. Paul and Barnabas are, we don't know exactly what happened, but this is not just, well, you go your way, I'll go my way. There's some emotion and some thought that they are really in very different places here. But somehow, somewhere along the way, it seems they figured it out.
Yeah. Well, I did have to go back to Acts to see if it's still possible for Paul to be writing this from Ephesus as opposed to Rome.
Yeah.
And it would be.
Right, it would.
In terms of the narrative of Acts.
Right.
In fact, it would be a shorter time.
It would. That's right. Because that's at the beginning of the second journey. This would be on the third journey.
Right.
So
in Acts, you're talking about the difference between the end of Acts 15 and Acts 19.
Right.
When Paul goes to Ephesus and stays. But even if it's in Rome, you're probably talking, I get Ephesus, I'm just guessing without doing the work completely, 5 years. And if it's Rome, it's 10 years.
Right.
In round numbers.
Right.
But either way, you have this wonderful reconciliation. And I would talk about, this would be a sermon, I would deal with conflict in the church and bringing conflict, bringing bringing conflict to resolution, and forgiving others, and recognizing the mission ultimately is greater, giving people second chances.
Yeah, I think it's one of the great stories that we have in this passage, and really one of the great stories in the New Testament, because Luke does not resolve it for us.
No, he doesn't come close to resolving it.
No, it's just left. But then Paul does, and I think bringing that back is, and of course he's looking, thinking the end of 2 Timothy, Paul's wanting Mark, right, as I remember. So
yeah,
they are brought back together, and that whole, you've received instructions about him, if he comes, welcome him. So Paul is commending him to them, just as he does Tychicus and the others. Anyhow.
Yeah. And then of course we have the passage in 2 Timothy, right?
Right.
And if you don't think Paul wrote Colossians, which you addressed in that introduction,
right,
introduction video, then it puts a different light on it. But this is, there's only one of these names that doesn't appear in Philemon. I skipped over it. It's Jesus Justus.
Right, because he's only mentioned here in the New Testament, right? As I remember.
This is pseudo Paul. The guy did a
lot of. Oh man, did a good job, didn't he?
Connected to Philemon. But yeah, this whole idea of, really, I put just as a quick title, Forgiven Brother, but I like this whole idea more of conflict resolution.
Right. Yeah.
In doing this. And then here's Barnabas, an encourager. Now, 2 months ago, I preached a series on influencers. That's a term used in America, social media influencers.
Right.
It may mean nothing to other brothers and sisters, but I preached on Barnabas, which is it's a sermon I've used before. Taking Barnabas through Acts, he gives generously to encourage others, give generously of our resources. Barnabas shares his property, sells his property, and gives the resources to the church. Believe in others when other people don't. This is Barnabas bringing Paul, then known as Saul, to the apostles in Jerusalem, which really gives this whole idea of Barnabas wanting to give Mark a second chance, a whole nuance there, a powerful nuance. And Paul doesn't want to do it, even though he's received a second chance in some ways. And then third, give others second chances when others won't. And that's Paul here in Acts 11, and primarily Mark in 15.
Sure.
Epaphras, prayer warrior. Notice, oh, sorry, I didn't. I put the title and forgot to go back and do the scripture.
Oh,
so that's all from the previous slide. Yeah. But if you go back real quickly to the Epaphras passage in verses 11 and 12,
right,
12 and 13.
12 and 13, yeah.
He's always wrestling in prayer for you. First point. What's the content of the prayer? That you may stand firm in all the will of God, mature and fully assured. And then I vouch for him, he's working hard for you. So and that could be 3 points. He's wrestling in prayer. He's stabilizing the church and he's working hard.
Right.
In ministry.
Yep.
And where are we?
Luke, okay. Demas, I don't know who you got there.
Yeah.
Oh, Demas, yeah.
Demas, right? Our dear friend Luke the I skip over Luke. There's not a whole lot on him.
There's not. Even though we got this huge chunk of the New Testament that's by Luke,
that's at least ascribed to him, right?
Right, right.
But this famous passage, do your best to come to me quickly, for Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me and has gone to Thessalonica. So I call him the quitter or the lover of this world. You can go to 1 John 2:15, which talks about the love of the world, and then James 4:4.
Another one of those passages I wish we knew more. We don't really know what's going on. We just have one little line there, but he seemed Paul's commending him here in Colossians, but then by 2 Timothy.
Yeah.
I mean, and that feeds into that whole, I mentioned the faithfulness theme, and you could draw that in, that part of the story in as well. Here he's commending Demas, but when he becomes unfaithful, then he's not. So again, that reinforces.
And what does Paul mean by that?
Well,
That
we don't know. I know
he
that's
loves
just
this
it.
world.
Right.
He also shows up Philemon 24. But F.F. Bruce says it may imply that some temporal interest took him off at a time when the imprisoned apostle would have valued his continued presence.
Yeah, we don't know that he's walked away from Jesus here. That's
Right.
not what Paul says. So
Yeah.
I'd love to know more. Yeah.
Archippus, the fellow soldier, which is language from Philemon. Again, well, I got really careless on this. 2 Timothy 4:10 is from the previous slide that I forgot to delete.
Oh, well.
So it should be Philemon. If you go to Philemon 1 and 2, he's referred to as the fellow soldier there. But there's this idea that complete the ministry.
Yeah.
It's McKnight who says we know three things. One, he had a ministry. 2, he's Paul's fellow soldier. 3, he's called to complete the ministry.
Right.
That's pretty close to 3-point sermon.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, that's definitely a series. I would not have even thought of it, but you could definitely do that. I mean, and it's not even a stretch, I don't think. I mean, you're pulling from biblical themes that are right there. So yeah. I think that works.
I suspect Charles Swindoll has a series similar to this, Paul's Co-Workers. And I don't think it's limited to Colossians. And that's, again, from a long time ago.
Right.
So,
and
but
you got lists of them elsewhere, especially Romans 16, which you referred to earlier. So
yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay, well, I mean, it's a different kind of passage, but there's still a lot of material there to pull from for preaching. And if you were preaching through the whole text of Colossians, it's not as though you wouldn't have something to preach from this passage. So we have enjoyed talking through Colossians. And as I said, I think we've got one more where we'll talk about Philemon, and then a few things where we're going to ask you for some questions and talk about how we deliver sermons. So we'll still have some more discussion, but we appreciate listening to us talking about Colossians.